There's a story, and it goes like this. The Algonquin Hotel sits majestically on West 44th Street in Midtown Manhattan, a mere 5-minute walk from Times Square. Inside the Rose Room, once hosted regular lunch meetings of New York's finest writers, performers and journalists, familiar names and familiar faces such as Harpo Marx, Dorothy Parker and Ruth Hale. At one such gathering in the spring of 1928, with the air still fresh with the last remnants of what was a fairly brutal winter, when he was at the height of his powers and preparing to write A Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway sat with some of his cohort, eating, well, and no doubt drinking, when one member of the group took a single dollar bill and said to Hemingway, "Ernest, you're surely one of America's finest writers. But I bet this single dollar that you could not write a story using just 6 words." Now, Hemingway sat for a moment and he took out a pen and wrote 6 words on a napkin. His friend took the napkin, read the text, nodded, and then handed over the dollar bill. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Stories are very powerful. They teach us, they elevate us, they enrich our lives, they help us find meaning and purpose. Stories can take us places that we can only dream about. Stories bind us together and they help us create connection. I've been telling stories all my life, and so have you. You've probably told dozens of stories in the last week. Every time you talk to someone for a catch-up or on a work call and you tell them about your weekend or how you're coping with life in general, or maybe your plans for a break in the future, you're telling stories. I've been storytelling continuously by doing stand-up, theatre, presenting on television and radio, in sales jobs, and especially in over 30 years of learning and development. So I'm going to go through some ideas to help you be a conscious storyteller. So let's continue. Firstly, a quick history lesson. The earliest form of storytelling can actually be seen in the paintings on cave walls. Of course, it was the ancient Greeks who mastered the art of oral storytelling, and they did that through poetry. It was Aristotle in his book Poetics that first began to critically analyse what it was that makes a good story.
You see, poetry is a medium of imitation. It seeks to represent or duplicate, through character, emotion or action, day-to-day life. Now, when you're talking about your tragedy, it comes from the effort of the poet or the writer to present men as nobler or better than they actually are in real life. Now, the hero should go from some sort of happiness, to misery. Comedy, antithetically, shows a lower type of person and reveals humans to be worse than they are in real life. Now, one of the elements, of course, in a great story is character. But the first and most important is plot. A plot must have a distinct beginning, middle and end. Because that's the soul of a piece if you really think about it.
And that was further expanded upon by German playwright Gustav Freytag.
You see, a plot needs to have 5 elements to be effective, in my opinion. Picture a pyramid. You've got your exposition in your introduction, your once upon a time, if you will. Then comes something we call rising action. Now that's some kind of event that leads the main characters on some kind of quest or a journey to achieve something or overcome an insurmountable obstacle. Then a climax. Now that's a turning point that changes the protagonist's fate. The falling action is the characters trying to resolve the fallout of the climax and get back to a normal state of mind or some kind of status quo. A bit like, let's say, solving a mystery, finding the bad guy, escaping the danger. And finally comes the denouement, where resolved and there's a release of tension. Now, in Shakespeare's denouement usually had the death of one of the main characters. But that's a wee bit of a downer, eh?
Although, that might be exactly what the writer wants you to take from it. You might learn a lesson from the folly of the characters. And that's the point. The point is to have a point. Intentionality is vital in storytelling. Having a lesson or a teaching moment, have something to say, either implicitly or explicitly. As Stephen Covey says, start with the end in mind. What feeling or teaching do I want as a storyteller to leave the listener with? Is it a sense of commitment? Is it excitement in a new way of working? Is it reassurance that the listener has support and help from me in uncertain times? Whatever the point is, make sure you have one. Generally, you want to keep stories down to just a few minutes. That way you're not spending too much time at the beginning on exposition or drawing out the time to an obvious climax of the story, or the lesson isn't hammered home too much at the end. So that's structure. Now, let's look at the effect of stories on your brain. When we're presented with data and words on a screen, three main parts of our brain become stimulated and engaged. The occipital lobe, which processes what we see, and the Broca's and Wernicke's areas, which specialise in the production and comprehension of language. And it's entirely appropriate. Information like that is not designed to enthuse you or engage you or inspire you. Not overtly, at least anyway. It's simply there to show you what happened before, what's happening now, and perhaps what you predict to happen in the future. It's there to tell a story. So why not just tell a story? In writing, we say show, don't tell. And that means we should give the listener thoughts, feelings, and actions rather than simply a description, because that makes data a lot more engaging. Let me give you an example. Telling goes like this. Here are the results of the first quarter. As you can see, product Y undersold against last year's numbers. We've seen a steady increase in the sale of product Z. Product X has been fairly linear, but still performs well. And showing sounds like this. When I look at those charts, I see some good news and I see some bad news. Product Y makes me feel sad. Product Z makes me feel excited. Product X, though. Product X confuses me. We've improved Product X in so many ways over the last few years. This was going to be the one. This was going to be our great discovery. Our children would surely one day ask us, were you involved with Product X? So what's wrong with Product X? Is it the competition breathing down our necks? Is Product X going the way of Product Y? A little cumbersome? A little out of date like an old CD player? No. I think there's something more subtle. And I'm going to tell you what that is and how we're going to fix it. Now, hopefully you want to know a little bit more about the plan for Product X. What I've attempted to do there is engage more of your brain. You see, when we hear stories, when we hear a narrative, when we show, don't tell, we experience emotion in the telling, and guess what? The listener likely will as well. Emotions live in our limbic system. The limbic system is comprised of four main parts: hypothalamus, the amygdala, the thalamus, and the hippocampus. All of these play a role in accessing, storing, and processing emotions and are key to interpreting and understanding stories. Our brains tend to be more effective when both parts are active, our logical brain and our creative and emotional brain. Our brains are programmed, they're hardwired for stories. They're not hardwired for PDFs or slide decks or spreadsheets. There are hundreds of research papers, studies, and theorems based on the effective use of story to move people towards action. Different chemicals are released depending on the tone of the story. For example, dopamine becomes released when a story has some intense incident, which leads to an increased focus and memory in the listener. Stories with humour create endorphins, the feel-good chemical. Another thing that happens when we tell stories, our brains connect with our listeners. Uri Hassan and his colleagues Greg Stevens and Lauren Silbert used MRI recordings to gauge the speaker-listener response to stories. The recordings showed that listeners' brains started to resemble the speaker's brain, or couple with it. In other words, the more listeners understood and related to what a speaker was saying, the more closely their brain responses mirror the speaker's brain responses. This is known as neural coupling. Now that we've covered some history, structure, and science, let's talk about delivery. Oral storytelling is a performance. In the often misinterpreted study, Albert Mehrabian, the Professor Emeritus of Psychology at UCLA, stated that in communication, 3 elements account differently for our liking for the person who puts forward a message concerning their feelings. Words account for 7%. Tone of voice accounts for 38%, and facial expressions and non-verbal cues account for 55% of the liking. So for effective and meaningful communication about emotions, and let's not forget, stories are most effective when they have emotion, these 3 parts of the message need to support each other. They need to have congruency. So when we're setting the scene of a story about calmness and serenity, our facial expressions, our hand gestures, our posture and tone of voice all need to communicate the same as our words. When we communicate excitement or panic or joy, the same rules, of course, apply. Here are a few more tips. Use present tense. The audience will feel the story more if it's happening now, instead of merely conveying a list of events that have occurred in the past. Make them happen now. Rather than I saw or I felt or I did something, tell me what you can see, what you're feeling, and what you're doing right now. Give sensory information to put the listener in the moment with you. By describing sensory information, it helps the listener access memories of their own. The smell of the sea, the warmth of the sun on your face, or the feeling of your feet sinking gently into wet sand. All of this transports us to the time and the place of the story alongside the storyteller. If there's dialogue, play each character. If you're speaking with an older person, adapt their stance and maybe their voice. Or an officious security person who won't let you into the building without your proper pass. Then again, this helps the listener relive the moment vividly and viscerally with you. Convey the full gamut of emotions that you want to instill in the listener, and give a slightly more heightened sense of those emotions. Don't be a little bit embarrassed. Be mortified, humiliated, or devastated. And be expressive with your voice. You can use pauses to build up tension. Use your pitch. Play with the pacing. Speed up and slow down. Use the volume. Use also light and shade. Use good descriptive words and similes. Instead of a light blue car, maybe the car could be as blue as the Caribbean morning sky. By all means, include some levity and some humour. A punchline at the end if you want to. And you could end, conversely, with some gravity. The moral teaching, the life-changing or life-affirming message that you want to put across to the listener. Storytelling's a skill. And it's one that's very much worthwhile learning and practicing. Stories, as we know, can be very powerful.